Hello and welcome back to Speaking of Courage. Like I mentioned last episode, how to move my location a little bit again. So I'll be trying different things. Probably end with the flag back here or something. The audio looks a little out of frame there. But hopefully there's less echo this time around. So today we're going to be telling the story of the first enlisted airman in the United States Air Force to earn the Medal of Honor, John Levitow, who earned the Medal of Honor in Vietnam. John Levitow was born November 1st, 1945 in Hartford, Connecticut, and grew up in the small community of Glastonbury, Connecticut. So definitely a East Coast Yankee. Now, surprisingly, there's not a lot of info about John's early life, even though he is, again, the first enlisted airman to receive the Medal of Honor. You'd like to think there would be more information out there, but I wasn't able to find much about him at all prior to joining the military. One thing that I did find was that he originally intended to join the United States Navy, but actually switched over and ended up joining the Air Force in June of 1966. Early part of the Vietnam War, but again, the war is escalating. So this is going to be someone that enlisting knowing that there is a chance to be going overseas and that he is going to end up in a combat zone. Much different than a lot of our country's history, where you might be joining during peacetime, or you might be joining with the idea that you might not have to actually go fight. When you're joining in 1966, there's a very strong possibility of that happening. So that's what he does. He's going to enlist in 1966, and his first job in the Air Force was actually going to be civil engineering. He ended up cross-training, though, into the loadmaster career field, which is where he ended up spending his time, becoming a loadmaster on an AC-47 gunship. John's military career wasn't perfect, and he was a little bit of a troublemaker while he was in the Air Force. John was eventually assigned to the 3rd Special Operations Squadron of the 14th Operations Wing, and he flew on a C-47 Spooky, which was sometimes called a Puff the Magic Dragon for the amount of firepower that those would be putting out. These C-47 gunships were specifically outfitted aircraft designed to provide support to soldiers on the ground. So this was the Air Force job. Not all of the Air Force planes are going to be up bombing the north. A lot of them are going to be giving close air support to the ground troops, and that's what these C-47s were for. They actually carried 21,000 rounds of 7.62 ammunition, which is going to be, similar to the type that's fired out of those M60 machine guns. 21,000 rounds. And the aircraft's 3 miniguns could accurately spew up to 6,000 rounds per minute to repulse enemy attacks on base camps or small night defensive positions. So for these ground guys that are going to be carrying however much firepower they have, if you're on a small patrol or something like that, you might have 1 machine gun, 2 machine guns. If you're a larger size element, you're going to have what you have. But guys on the ground or in a base camp, if you think of some of our previous episodes where the guys are out there, they might even be in an artillery position. You only have what you can carry. Now you might call in support from these big Air Force ships that are going to have 21,000 rounds of this 7.62, which they're going to be able to deliver in rapid succession. So these Spookies, as they were called, were manned by 7 or 8 Air Force crew members, which would usually be 2 pilots, a navigator, 2 gunners, a loadmaster, and a flight engineer, and occasionally they would have a South Vietnamese observer. Now, not only could these Spooky gunships master air-to-ground combat, which was, again, flying in support and attacking those enemy troops that were on the ground, in 20 seconds, they could also turn the darkest night into an artificial daylight. And the way they did that was with flares. So not only were they putting rounds downrange and putting rounds on target, they were able to use these flares and put out so much of this artificial light that there would be like a daylight element to it, right? So if you were on the ground and you were getting attacked by this unseen enemy, these ships would fly overhead, you'd call in support, and they're putting out these flares, and it's going to cause this illumination. In ways, the enemy own the night, right? You're stuck, they're moving through. We have the technology to back us, but when you can't see the enemy, it's terrifying. And then all of a sudden, this eerie light, these little parachutes are going to be floating down. I remember when I was in the Army and we would see the flares, and you see them pop, and then they would go, because you can launch them from the ground or they can be launched from the sky, mortars, other ways. But it was, you kind of freeze, close one eye is the way they train you to keep your night vision, but they just kind of linger, and it's amazing how much light they put out. So that can be a game changer, though. If you're in a position, you don't know where the enemy's coming from, you're just seeing muzzle flashes, and then all of a sudden the sky's lit up. Now you on the ground can put rounds downrange. You can find the enemy and you can kill them. So huge benefit that they have. So the way that, again, that the Spookies did this was with 5 dozen MK-24 flares. And these consisted of magnesium, that illuminated the light with 2 million candle power, and they burned at 3,000 to 4,000 degrees. I didn't realize candle power was a unit of measurement, but apparently that's how they determine how bright something is. So these flares, again, 2 million candle power with 3,000 to 4,000 degrees is what they're burning out. And this magnesium was encased in 27-pound tubes. They were 6 inches in diameter and 2 or 3 feet long. I read both. Sometimes it'll say 2 feet, sometimes 3. I've seen up to 4. But long cylindrical tubes, which are going to be very heavy, right? Because it's 27 pounds. So if you think of if you're at the gym and you're lifting the 25-pound weight, it's going to be encapsulated in this. So if you stretch it out, it's kind of a heavy bar almost, right? And the way that these were used was the flares were manually thrown out of an open cargo bay door of the AC-47. So to me, that concept's crazy, having that open doors and just launching those out. That would be, I'm scared of heights, I'm scared of flying. The idea of that is nuts to me, but that's what they did. So it was actually a 2-man process. So the loadmaster, which would be Levitow, would get one of the large flares off of the rack, set the timers and the fuse delay to ignite the magnesium, and attach a 10-foot lanyard to the safety pin. Then the loadmaster is going to pass that flare to one of the gunners, and when the pilot gives them the command, they're going to just toss that canister out the open cargo bay. After the flare travels the 10-foot distance from the lanyard, that's where that pin's going to be attached to, so it's going to be enough to get clear. The safety pin is going to be jerked out of the flare, and a small charge will release a parachute to slow the canister's descent to the ground. So that's going to give it longer hang time to have that illumination for those ground troops or for whoever need it. And that magnesium would ignite to illuminate the sky for up to 3 minutes as the flare drifted slowly down. Up to 3 minutes for each one of those flares. And they're going to be launching, as many as necessary out that door. They're going to be dropping those out the door, if you will. For the grunts on the ground, these C-47s or AC-47s, spookies, are going to be, it's like having the cavalry come to back you, right? When you're in your worst position, this massive amount of firepower and this something that can bring daylight to the night is going to be on call to be able to protect you. So it's an awesome feeling, and it's something, it's when you're out on a patrol, I keep saying patrol, or a larger size unit that's moving into contact or has been attacked or on a base camp or something. This is almost like Big Brother coming to get you. It's that feeling that you're not alone, and that's a powerful thing. I just can't, overemphasize. Imagine being a scared young grunt, perhaps a draftee or perhaps enlisted, perhaps, 18, 19 years old, being pinned down somewhere, and the enemy controls the night. You're fighting for your life. People are wounded, people are bloody, people are screaming. You're calling for artillery, you're calling for all these things, and they're coming. You're waiting for a QRF, or you're waiting for another unit to come save you. Feeling overwhelmed by this unseen enemy, and then the C-47 is going to come, and you're going to hear those sound of those miniguns. If you've seen like Black Hawk Down, the sounds of that, and the amount of firepower these things can put out is insane. It's very, very impressive. So this curtain of lead that they're going to lay down, and according to what I read, these spookies can fire so many rounds that they can put 1 round down for every square foot of the area they're attacking. So if you're the enemy, you're not surviving that, right? If they're out in the open, these enemy troops that are going to be attacking, 1 round per every square foot is going to be being hit by these 7.62 rounds. So obviously this is extremely, extremely valuable. And this is what Levitow was doing. He was going to be on these spooky gunships. And Levitow's unit would conduct nightly missions. So their ships would be named Spooky 71, 72, 73, 74. So every night when darkness came, Spooky 71 and Spooky 73, those are 2 different C-47 airships, are going to take to the air to find and destroy the enemy. They're going to go around supporting whoever needs support, essentially. And these 2 aircraft would work until midnight, and then they would return to refuel and rearm for the next night's mission. At midnight, there was a different crew, and Spooky 72 and Spooky 74 would fly from midnight to dawn. So all the nighttime hours, the darkness hours, are going to be covered by these alternating 2 crews. So on February 24th, 1969, Levitow was 23 years old. So a little bit older than a lot of these guys that we profile. And he was actually asked to fill in for the regular loadmaster on Spooky 71. So it wasn't even his regularly scheduled mission, but he was filling in to repay a favor for that loadmaster who had taken his shift, if you want to call it that, for a night when he was sick. So he was going to be working with Major Carpenter's crew to return this favor. Major Carpenter is going to be the pilot on this mission. This was actually Levitow's 181st air mission over the night skies of Vietnam, which is crazy because you think about World War II, you know, the early days of the Air Corps when it's 25 missions and go home. Later that was upped a lot, but surviving 181 missions is crazy when you think about all the things they faced. Obviously, the intensity isn't going to be the same as you know, bombing Germany in World War II, but there's a lot of dangers. There's a lot of anti-aircraft fire. There's a lot of things that could happen. So doing 181 missions protecting this is one, it's going to show his level of experience, but two, it's just, to me, it's overwhelming how much these guys went through. So on this mission, Spooky 71 was flying near Tan Son Nut Air Base when Long Binh came under attack. So around 11 o'clock, remember their shift's supposed to end around midnight. So around 11 o'clock, they get a desperate call from help. So from deep in the jungle, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had attacked a large-scale attack on several American positions in Long Binh. So these ground guys are needing help, and these American outposts are coming under heavy mortar and rocket attack from concealed positions. And as the enemy soldiers are going to be probing the American positions, the grunts on the ground are starting to get injured. They're starting to get killed. They're starting to desperately need help, right? They're fighting off the enemy with everything they have, but they need the support from the Levitow's unit and these gunships. So they're going to call on these Spookies for help, and as soon as they receive the distress call, Major Carpenter is going to pilot his Spooky 71 and to go try to help these guys. And like I said, this is the cavalry coming, right? You need to hold on as long as you can on the ground. You need to fight off the enemy as hard as you can, and then hopefully this big giant beast is going to come through the sky. It's going to fly low, and it's going to put down that devastating rain of metal on these enemy soldiers, and hopefully it's going to protect you. By this point, Levitow and his crew, I say Levitow and his crew, he's part of the crew. He's the lower enlisted guy on there, right? But the crew that Levitow is a part of have already been flying for about 4.5 hours supporting other infantrymen on the ground. Their shift should have ended at midnight, but they have to fulfill this mission, right? They don't have time to wait for the other crews to get up and to get going. So they're going to fly in and they're going to do what they can. And as they get there, the enemy's going to seem to be everywhere, right? They have a bird's eye view looking down. You're going to see the muzzle flashes. You're going to see the mortars. You're going to see the rockets. You're going to see explosions. So they have to do what they can to protect these guys. So Levitow's crew is going to start firing thousands of rounds at the unseen enemy below, and they're going to be launching these flares to illuminate the sky. So just like we talked about, this C-47 is going to be doing what it's designed for. They're going to fire those miniguns by the thousands until their barrels are smoking hot. And they're going to be launching those flares to illuminate the sky, to give light to the friendly troops below to see to the enemy so they can actually do their job. So coming in low, that pilot's going to be flying and he's going to be raking and devastating the enemy troops. Levitow's going to be doing, as we talked about, right? He's going to be working hand in glove, as they call it, to keep those miniguns firing and to drop the illumination. So on the pilot's command, Levitow and the gunner began deploying those flares just like they had been trained to do through that open cargo door, which again is terrifying to me, just the thought of having an open door up in the air. So just as they were trained to do, and just as they've done probably countless times, Levitow is going to be setting the timer and handing those flares to the gunner. And that gunner is going to be holding it with his finger through the pull ring attached to the safety pin, waiting for the signal to drop those. And the C-47 isn't just flying idly, right? They've destroyed 2 enemy mortar positions. They're actually putting devastating fire on the enemy. They're doing their job. This pilot's very skilled. So after destroying the 2 enemy mortar positions, a 3rd mortar position was located, and the pilot began to bank the Spooky 71 to swing back for another pass over the enemy. Meanwhile, in the cargo hold, Levitow's removing one of the flares from the rack to set the timers, and he passed it to Airman First Class Ellis Owen. So there's all these things that happen simultaneously. Everybody on this crew is doing their job. The pilots, they're locating the targets they're finding. He's turning the ship to come in low to attack these enemy. Levitow's doing his job in the back. He's setting the timers. He's handing them to Owen in this case. And Owen's going to brace himself against the door and prepare to toss the canister from the open cargo door. But as he's about to do so, Spooky 71 is going to be hit by a tremendous explosion. Multiple airmen in the aircraft were wounded. Sergeant Edward Fusey was wounded in the back and neck, and he remembered, "I saw Sergeant Bear, Airman Owen, and Airman Levitow go down right away." And Bear's going to be covered in blood. So these guys are going to be disoriented. Just boom, there's this big blast, and he's looking, and everybody in this hold is basically falling down and they're wounded. So what happened was, as they were banking for this second run on the enemy, slightly over 1,000 feet, so they're flying pretty low, the aircraft actually flew directly into the path of an enemy 82 millimeter mortar round. So that shows you how low they are too, right? If a mortar is going to hit them. So they're actively involved in this attack, and the enemy's actively fighting this ship, right? They're coming in, a mortar round comes, and I don't know if that's a lucky blast or what that is, but it's going to have a devastating effect on this aircraft. So Spooky 71 is going to lurch violently and wildly into the air, shaking as an explosion ripped a 2 to 3 foot hole in the right wing. Just to keep going back to aircraft travel, right? If you've ever been on a plane and felt that turbulence, how scary that is, and you can tell yourself, well, it's just turbulence, it's nothing to actually be scared of. In this case, it actually is. They're flying, they're banking, that's already going to be terrifying. They have an open cargo door, and they're hit so hard that this explosion is going to rip shrapnel through. It's going to injure almost everybody in the back, and now there's a giant hole in the wing. So to me, that's just terrifying. This mortar shell exploded inside the structure, raking the fuselage, with more than 3,500 pieces of shrapnel just ripped through, just puncturing through, just flying shards of metal, punching small, tiny little holes throughout the aircraft to include a 2 to 3 foot hole in the wing, right? So that's just, to me, I can't think of anything more terrifying. So all these guys in the back, or many of these guys in the back, are going to be wounded, including Levitow, who was hit by shrapnel and experienced a concussion, right? We've talked about this numerous times on the show. A concussion's not something small. It's going to feel like you're hit in the head with a bat, right? And then your mind's going to be swimming. So he ended up having more than 40 shrapnel wounds in his back and legs, and he's bleeding profusely, and he's also dizzy from this blast. Blast close enough to just rip him apart with metal. Some of that is going to be actual potentially pieces of the mortar on that explosion, but also it's going to be pieces of metal from the plane that were thrown, that were ripped into him and these other guys. So he's dripping blood. He's swimming in his mind, disoriented, and you just got to be terrified. The plane's lurching. You know there was an explosion. You don't know if this is going to be immediate death or if you're going down. In the cockpit, Major Carpenter struggling to control the aircraft, which, is probably very difficult to do with the shock of the blast and also with that giant hole in the wing. So the pilot's trying to stabilize the aircraft, and Levitow's looking down and assessing his wounds, trying to come to his senses from that blast and trying to see how bad he is. I don't think it can be stressed enough, and I always repeat this. I know I'm very repetitive, but it's one thing to be wounded, but it's another thing to not know how badly wounded you are, right? You don't know when you look down and you're feeling pain everywhere and you're bleeding everywhere, and everywhere you look, there's your clothes have holes. You might not know if your legs are intact or your arms are intact or how bad that's going to be. And in this case, he has 40 pieces of shrapnel that they ended up finding on his body. So that's going to show you how bad it was. But he's an airman. He's a member of the United States military. He's a professional, and he has courage. So he's gonna assess himself, and then he's gonna assess the plane and the rest of the crew. And as he looks, he's gonna see that one of the gunners is knocked down, bleeding heavily, wounded, seriously wounded, and he's gonna be near that open cargo door. Now, what does that mean, right? Obviously, we're stable enough to be dropping flares out, so you're not gonna get sucked out of the open cargo door. But now the plane's lurching, the plane's bouncing. The pilot's trying to pull up from a dive, and we've already been hit by a mortar. We could hit by another one. So one wrong shift from this plane, and that gunner could be thrown from the plane, or he could roll out, and there's no way to save him. These guys aren't wearing parachutes. The pilot's struggling to control the plane. People are wounded, and that guy's unable to defend himself. So as the plane is plummeting, it's in a dive at this point. John realizes he has to save his partner. Levitow realizes he has to do something. So despite how badly his wounds are aching, he's going to struggle to get to his feet. And every part of him was hurting, right? There's shrapnel all throughout his body. And again, that head, his ears are probably ringing. His head's probably throbbing, all of those places. But he actually didn't have pain in his legs because they were numb from everything that hit him. But that made it difficult to walk. So he was able to pull himself to his feet, even though he wasn't sure he could do so, and he started walking to the door with numb legs, right? Trying to fight the pull of the plane, lurching and going, and the pilot struggling, and despite all of his pain and everything else that was going on, and not knowing what other dangers are around or if they're going to get hit again. But he's got to save this guy. So as Spooky 71 continues to bounce and Major Carpenter's struggling to control it, John Levitow is struggling, and he's going to make his way near the open doorway, and he's going to reach down and he's going to grab that injured gunner by his shirt, and he's going to be able to pull him, right? But as he grabs him, now they're both near the door. So think about the danger he's putting himself in too, because I just mentioned, a wrong bank or anything, the gunner could go out the door, but now Levitow's got a hold of him. They can both go out. But somehow he was able to risk his life, and he was able to summon the strength. And even though he's dripping with blood and he's in intense pain, despite all his weakness, he's able to pull this guy to safety. So rather than him being wounded and laying down and waiting for someone to help him, he immediately gets up and drags this guy to a safer area. As heroic as that was, though, right? As soon as he does that, he's going to notice a much more serious threat. He's going to see smoke, and it's going to be coming from inside the cargo hold, which indicates there's a possible fire. Okay, and that's a really bad thing. With all of the munitions and explosions on this aircraft, a fire could result in devastation and death, right? An explosion over the night skies that no one's going to help you from. And a fire in this confined compartment could set off the thousands of rounds of ammunition and all of these flares. So they don't know what caused it. We don't know initially, did shrapnel hit something and cause it to explode? Is there a small fire? Is it some equipment malfunction? But these rounds, if they start popping off, it's going to be bad. I've mentioned on the show before, when I was in Iraq, one of our Bradleys was hit by a vehicle-borne IED, improvised explosive device. And after the initial explosion and after we got the wounded troops out, all of the rounds started popping off, and it just sounded like popcorn. All the machine gun fire in there, all of the 25 millimeter rounds, just, explosion for minutes. That's on a burning Bradley on the ground. Put that in an aircraft in the sky, and it's devastation for everybody. So Levitow's quickly trying to take account of the situation, and now things are going to get much worse when he realizes it's not a fire that's happening that could potentially be put out. It's actually one of the flares that's on fire. And actually what happened was one of these 27-pound flares is now loose, right? And remember, we talked about how hot those burn. Up to 2 million candle power, right? And they're burning it at 3,000 to 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. What had happened was actually the flare that John had set the timers for, that Levitow had set the timers for and handed to Owen to toss through the doorway. When that explosion rocked the plane, Owen dropped that giant flare, which rolled to the ground and caused the canister, to lose from his grip and to be loose in the plane. So to emphasize again, this is 27 pounds. It's pretty big. My machine gun was 27.6 pounds, and that thing got heavy after a while. So now compress that, elongate it, and put it into a heavy, actually I should be making it larger, a heavy tube. So that thing's rolling around. And we talked about the process for these deploying. So if this thing goes off, right, inside the plane, it's going to burn so hot with that magnesium that nothing's going to be able to stop it. Once it starts, you're not going to be able to put it out, and that's just going to result in death for everybody on that crew and the loss of that aircraft. The other problem is the 20-second fuse on this thing, right? So when you set the timer, these timers are set for 20 seconds. So 20 seconds from that pin being pulled, this thing is going to start to ignite, which is problematic because that's 20 seconds from when it flew from the gunner's grasp, or when they don't know if it was pulled by the gunner inadvertently or if it was around his finger, if it was on the hook, what happened, but 20 seconds from that explosion, essentially. So what's already happened in 20 seconds? Levitow's been wounded. He's assessed his wounds. He's struggled to the door. He's drugged someone away. How many seconds was that? Was that 5 seconds? Was that 10 seconds? But time is ticking. So we literally have a ticking time bomb on the ground in this aircraft that someone has to get to. And Levitow is the only one that's going to be seeing this and trying to do something about it. So fighting the aircraft's baking angle, fighting all of his pain, fighting the noxious gas that he's going to be smelling as he's going to be moving forward. Levitow is going to try to grab a hold of this flare and launch it out the window because that's their only hope. So Levitow is going to start crawling across this fuselage of this plane, and this flare is going to be rolling back and forth, right? And think about that 20 seconds like a ticking time bomb. This is like a nightmare or a horror movie. If you put this in a movie, it would be a little bit too much, right? You're like, okay, but this is what Levitow's facing. Still bleeding, probably getting weaker from the blood loss. He has to ignore his own pain and try to chase this canister around as it's rolling, and as the pilot, who doesn't even know this is going on, is trying to save the plane from this crash. From this dive. So Levitow's going to be crawling towards the canister, and he's going to reach for it, and as he does so, it's going to roll away just out of his grasp, right? He's going to continue his struggle. He's going to do it again. trying to make another attempt. And once again, as he gets close, he's going to reach out his outstretched hand, and that canister is going to roll out of his grip. Levitow is going to continue to struggle, and they were actually later able to piece together where he went by his blood across the floor of this aircraft. He's going to reach close enough to grab that canister, and he's going to realize if he reaches out and he grabs that, tries to grab that again, and he's unsuccessful, they're all going to be doomed because he doesn't have enough time. So in desperation, he makes a decision. He knows he only has one thing to do. If he misses that, he gets no more chances. So despite his pain, despite the shock, despite everything that's going on, despite the chaos, despite the terror of the plane descending, Levitow makes a decision that he's going to try to do something to save the rest of his crew. So what John does is he crawls as close as he can to that incendiary device that's heavy, and he's going to throw his body on top of it. And if you guys remember our story on Henry Irwin, it's going to be very similar to that. He's going to throw himself on top of that canister and cradle it with his body so it's not rolling anymore. And now the canister has ceased to roll. It's pinned to the floor by John, and his blood is going to be intermixing with that as he's doing what he can to hold on to it. But the danger's not gone, right? Because when that thing ignites, John's body won't protect the rest of the crew. Even if it does initially, it's going to melt through and it's going to burn into the hold. Once that canister ignites, it's going to burn at 4,000 degrees and it's going to burn straight through. So prior to that happening, John's got to get that thing out, right? So he's risking all of this to get this canister out before it starts that fire. And how much time does he have left? We don't know. Is it 10 seconds? Is it 5 seconds? Is it 4 seconds? Is he done, right? But John's able to hug that smoking time bomb to his body, and he's going to start crawling towards that open cargo bay door. He doesn't have the strength to stand up. He doesn't have the strength to, pick up that 27 pounds as he's ripped with 47 shrapnel wounds, CTE from the head injury, exhaustion, muscle soreness, and everything else. But he's able to crawl and to hug that to his body, that 27-pound canister, as the smoke is wafting from it, right, as it's getting ready to go. And he doesn't know. Any second could be his last, but if it's his last, it's going to be everybody's last. So he's going to struggle despite the pain, despite his badly torn, bleeding legs. He's going to be dragging his body towards that open bay door that he had been at previously, that he saved that other airman from, right? So this is going to be a superhuman effort, essentially, right? We can never replicate this, but think of yourself at your weakest and your worst after you've done some type of martial arts or an event or went for a run or anything, and then have someone stab you 40 times and then have to accomplish this Herculean effort. But that's what he's doing. He's crawling towards that door. And despite all the odds, he made it to that open cargo bay door. And with his last ounce of strength, he was able to throw that 27-pound bomb into the night. And as the flare passed through the doorway, it was pushed away by the propeller wash. And right as it did so, that flare exploded into a brilliant light. And everybody that was alive on the plane was able to see just how close they came, right? You can just imagine watching John feeling the plane, feeling the pressure, feeling your own wounds, watching John struggle, and just desperately hoping he makes it. Watching him heave that out, and right as it gets pushed clear of the plane, seeing that illumination, just like it's designed to do, right? It's not an explosion, it's not shrapnel, it's the magnesium's igniting, which would have been igniting through the floor. So through John's effort, he was able to push that flare out, save the crew, and ultimately save the plane and everybody on board. And up front, the pilot was still continuing to struggle. He had no idea what was going on in the back of his plane. All he knows is that he was hit, he probably had wounded, and that he was struggling. But after his valiant effort, he was able to get the aircraft under control, and he was able to set an emergency course for Benoit. And eventually they made it, and he was able to manage a safe landing where medical crews rushed forward to remove the wounded crew members. While he was en route, he had actually called, and notified, I got multiple wounded. I need an ambulance and a medevac helicopter on the ramp, and they were waiting for him. As they were pulling these guys off, Levitow was drenched with blood and exhaustion, and he actually initially refused to board the helicopter. He had to be ordered to do so by the pilot because he wasn't thinking of his own injuries at that time, right? He wanted to stay there. But eventually he was forced to be taken for medical treatment. And he actually remembered very little of what happened. After the shock of the events and after he was treated, he couldn't, everything had probably happened so fast and he was so badly wounded. But in the light of the day, Major Carpenter surveyed the damage to his AC-47, and he was actually able to piece together what happened. And he later said, quote, "After the mission, I was able to reconstruct what happened by the blood trail left by John. He collapsed after throwing the flare overboard and was evacuated to the base hospital immediately upon landing. In my experience, I have never seen such a courageous act performed under such adverse circumstances. The entire 8-man crew owes their lives to John, and his quick reactions surely saved the aircraft. It was not possible to bail out, as we had 2 seriously injured men aboard, one of them John Levitow. However, how the plane ever flew back to base, I'll never know. How a plane with over 3,500 holes in the wings and fuselage stayed airborne defies description. One hole measured 3 feet and 1/4 inches. End quote. So that's the pilot, right? And you can imagine him, again, surviving. He's his plane was hit by a mortar, which is insane. Not surface to air missiles, a mortar. That's how low they were. But he's fighting, struggling to control this plane. He fought this courageous battle as well, and then realizing, oh my God, look at my crew, and then realizing, oh my God, what happened? This one guy saved us, and being able to track that by the blood. It's kind of a visceral, representation of these acts. I guess I think that's why it's kind of powerful. It got me a little shaken here, but just the idea of being able to see his literal life force that he drug around to save these other guys. So Levitow fortunately survived the incident. He was actually flown to an Air Force hospital in Tachikawa, Japan. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but they had to cut away the dead and contaminated flesh to prevent infection, and they removed 40 pieces of shrapnel from between his knee and his hip. So a big blast. You can just imagine how bad that would hurt. And shrapnel is going to be of various sizes. It's just, little shards of metal. But he ended up spending 2 months recuperating in Japan. But when this was over, rather than going home as a hero, he decided to go back to Vietnam in April, and he ended up flying 20 more combat missions until the end of his tour, which is insane. Just think of the courage and the dedication to the mission and your teammates to do something like that. After his tour, he returned stateside and completed his enlistment as a C-147 loadmaster at Norton Air Force Base in California, which is about 5 minutes from where I'm sitting at right now, Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino here. So it's pretty cool to be around where some of this took place. And 6 months after that fateful February night, John was actually discharged from the military as a sergeant. And it was actually a clerical error that he got out. They had a bad re-enlistment code. It's kind of a long story. It'd be a whole nother issue of some of the military's incompetence that prevented him from being able to stay in. But that's neither here nor there. But he ended up being discharged as a sergeant. And he later said, quote, "I'm just lucky," whenever they would ask him about his heroic actions. So he remained very humble. He said, quote, luck is all it is. It's very easy to do something and not be recognized. I'm sure there are people who have served and have done things that have simply been amazing and have never been recognized," end quote. And that's a huge thing here, right? Because what if he had failed? His actions wouldn't have been any less heroic, but nobody would have known about them because everybody on that crew would have died, right? Or if he had bled out from his injuries and nobody realized what he had done and there wasn't the blood trail, or people didn't realize that there was a flare. So it does bring up a good point of all those countless valorous actions that were never recognized or notified or noticed. And he recognized that, which is pretty powerful too, right? And some of the times when he was asked about, how he accomplished what he did, he would laughingly say that he had temporary insanity. So kind of cool how humble he was for his actions that day. And on May 14th, 1970, Levitow received the Medal of Honor from President Richard Nixon on Armed Forces Day. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, he was the first enlisted airman to receive the Medal of Honor. And he actually became the lowest ranked serviceman in the Air Force to receive the Medal of Honor. And partly because of this, Levitow became kind of an Air Force icon. He's kind of like a patron saint almost of the enlisted guys, especially of the lower enlisted. They made the John Levitow Award, which is the highest honor presented to a graduate of Air Force enlisted professional military education, which includes the Airman Leadership School, the NCO Academy, and the Senior NCO Academy. And to be eligible for that award, the graduate must be in the top 1% of their class, his or her class. So that's cool because in the Army and the infantry, you have the Audie Murphy Award and you have these heroes that are representative. So it's a cool way that his name is represented and carried on. After leaving the Air Force, John like a lot of these guys, decided to find a career that would help him continue to serve his fellow service members. So for 22 years, he served in his home state's Veterans Administration, and eventually he became the assistant to the commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Veterans Affairs, which is pretty cool. On January 23rd, 1998, the Air Force unveiled a C-17 aircraft named the Spirit of John Levitow, which was the first time an Air Force plane had been named after an enlisted airman. Again, that enlisted thing's pretty cool, I think. And I like that it's not named the John Levitow, it's the Spirit of John Levitow. I'm sure that's partly a nod to, like the Spirit of St. Louis. But to me, it's the spirit, the courage that he had that carried him. It's representing him, but it's also representing that what was inside him that night, which, hopefully can inspire other and future airmen. And John Levitow was able, actually there when they dedicated that, and he was able to tour the cockpit and unveil that logo, which was probably a pretty big honor for him. Sadly, on November 8th, 2000, John Levitow died of cancer, and he was only 55 years old. And he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, which a lot of these guys are. And he was survived by his son, John Jr., his daughter, his mother, a sister, and a grandson. And now I'm going to read his citation. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty, Sergeant Levitow, then Airman First Class, U.S. Air Force, distinguished himself by exceptional heroism while assigned as a loadmaster aboard an AC-47 aircraft flying a night mission in support of the Long Bin Army Post. Sergeant Levitow's aircraft was struck by a hostile mortar round. The resulting explosion ripped a hole 2 feet in diameter through the wing, and fragments made over 3,500 holes in the fuselage. All occupants of the cargo compartment were wounded and helplessly slammed against the floor and fuselage. The explosion tore an activated flare from the grasp of a crew member who had been launching the flares to provide illumination for Army ground troops engaged in combat. Sergeant Levitow, then stunned by the concussion of the blast and suffering from over 40 fragment wounds in the back and legs, staggered to his feet and turned to assist the man nearest to him, who had been knocked to the ground and was bleeding heavily. As he was moving his wounded comrade forward and away from the open cargo compartment door, he saw the smoking flare ahead of him in the aisle. Realizing the danger involved and completely disregarding his own wounds, Levitow started towards the burning flare. The aircraft was partially out of control, and the flare was rolling wildly from side to side. Sergeant Levitow struggled forward despite the loss of blood from his many wounds and the partial loss of feeling in his right leg. Unable to grasp the rolling flare with his hands, he threw himself bodily upon the burning flare. Hugging the deadly device to his body, he dragged himself back to the rear of the aircraft and hurled the flare through the open cargo door. At that instant, the flare separated and ignited in the air, but clear of the aircraft. Sergeant Levitow, by his selfless and heroic actions, saved the aircraft and its entire crew from certain death and destruction. Sergeant Levitow's gallantry, his profound concern for his fellow men, and the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Air Force and reflect great credit upon himself and the armed forces of this country. And I wanted to end this with a article from John's hometown newspaper, the Glastonbury Citizen. After his death, they posted a note about John's life, and it said, quote, "John's life had been one of tireless volunteerism, a role model, a mentor, with other enlisted professional education at the center of everything he did. If John Levitow became a celebrity for his fleeting moments of valor one February night in Vietnam, he became a hero for more than 30 years of dedicated service that followed that fateful night." End quote. And that's the story of John Levitow. So hopefully you guys like that one. Let me know down below if you guys want to hear any other stories in specific or what your guys' thoughts are on John. Like I said, I like, conversation and dialogue, but with a lot of these, it's the impact of the 8 guys on that crew are going to be obvious, but think about all the guys on the ground that never knew that these guys are up and this guy's doing this for them. Think about those infantrymen on the ground that were protected by all of these missions that John and these other guys did. I think it's just a powerful thing. And you take the big picture, of combat in general, and then you narrow that down to, Vietnam and then the Air Force, which is going to be real small as far as valor medals go in these pictures. And then you shrink it down even more, isolated into the blood trail across the fuselage of that aircraft, and that's a microcosm of what valor is, and that's a microcosm of what self-sacrifice is, and that's a microcosm of why we have the Medal of Honor. So I think it's a pretty cool story. Hopefully you guys liked it. Like I said, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching.